There we go. Perfect. All right. All right. Sorry. I was having problems connecting to the display. I just had to do the age-old turn it off and back on again. So I have a beef to pick with you guys. So you recall, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was talking about we'll do Ruth, and it's perfect because Ruth has 4 chapters and I've got 4 weeks. And the whole time I was thinking that that next week was like the last Sunday in November when it's actually the first Sunday in December. And you let me stand up here and make a fool of myself talking about four days for Ruth. But so here's the deal. I don't want to try to rush through the end of this today. I like being able to take our time. So we're just going to continue through December. So next week is the town hall meeting. And then we'll come back and revisit this on the 8th when the bishop is here, and then maybe the 15th as well too. I don't know about the 22nd. That's the Sunday before Christmas. So we'll see. But then also Jamie McCarr and I are talking about doing some kind of like intergenerational art project in one of those days. Maybe we'll make Advent wreaths or something like that. So we'll do something together with the kids. I don't know. But there will be something during the education hours slot up until the 22nd, maybe the 22nd as well too, depending on how things go. FYI.
I got a question pertaining to the lesson. Are you ready to start?
Yeah.
Okay, first question. So you've got this group of people, this tribe,
Yep.
that moved from place to place, from Egypt and then down to the desert, and then
Yeah. Yep.
So what's their land ownership system?
That is a fascinating question. So, one of the important things, and this is actually going to come up in the sermon today, is that during this time period, there are 12 unique tribes that, like any collection of semi-independent states, get along sometimes, and a lot of the time don't get along. And that is the role of the judge. So the book of Judges, right, which is between the Pentateuch and, there's Joshua, then Judges, then 1 Samuel, which is what I'm going to reference today. Judges describes what that looks like. So 12 independent tribes that are mediated between by the judge. And that judge, despite the name, is not there to deal with civil issues or criminal issues. It's specifically making sure that the tribes don't fight each other, right? So that's important to remember because this is why this text pays a lot of attention to, Elimelech's family, they're Ephraimites, but they're living in Bethlehem, which is in Judah, is because what marks that time period before the monarchy is a lot of tension between the different tribal identities. So getting back to your question, what does land ownership look like? Land ownership looks kind of like the Wild West in that you make a claim and you defend your claim, right? So, and that might be a little simplistic. And this is one of those things where it would be great if we had a better picture of it, and if my friends Anna and Ryan were here, they might be able to give you a little bit more detail. But by and large, you don't have, you're not registering a deed with somebody, right? You make a claim, you protect that claim, you farm that claim, right? But if you're not there anymore, and there isn't anybody that remembers that, that's your land, then it's kind of up for grabs. But that's just kind of how the ancient world functions in general, right? Which is vastly different from a modern perspective of like the idea that I can purchase a property. I've got 120 acres of hardwoods in northeast Michigan, And, when my dad dies, that will come to me and my brother. Nobody's going to just come in and say, well, that's ours now, right? I don't have to station guards to defend our land against other people. Now, it isn't quite that mercenary. I mean, after all, this, the point of governance is to guarantee these kinds of things, right? So by and large, you don't have people coming in and squatting on your land and laying a claim on it. But a lot of it has to do with whether or not you're using it, right? So Boaz in this case is arguably a wealthy man, right? He has this piece of land. Apparently he has maybe a house in Bethlehem as well too. But he's the type of person that might have multiple places that are being farmed. But a lot of scenarios are similar to what happens throughout the Middle Ages even, which is a lot of the people that are farming this land are the equivalent of indentured servants, right? They've sold themselves, for more or less into Boaz's service, and so he takes care of them, feeds them, houses them, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's again a little bit more complex. So this is why when we talk about slavery in the biblical world, it's a little bit more nuanced than when we talk about slavery in the beginning of the 19th century in America. Is that there are different types of slaves, and sorry, I'm getting into a little bit more detail than you asked for, but by and large, slaves aren't people that you captured and are forcing to work for you. They're people that are on the lower strata of the economic ladder and are working because they don't have another option, right? Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I was trying to think if they had, I was thinking about all this.
Yeah.
I was thinking if they had, wondering if they had like written records of this is Boaz's field.
Yes.
Somebody took care of that, or?
Yes, probably. So, in fact, this is interesting archaeological stuff as well, too. Something just popped up in the news. I don't know if anybody caught it, but they found a cylinder, which we're not entirely sure what it was, in an excavation somewhere in Syria or Iraq, that now pushes back alphabetic language like 500 years. So, again, sorry, this is tangent, but this is an interesting tangent. So, there are two forms of language, written language in the ancient world, hieroglyphic and alphabetic, right? Hieroglyphs are symbols that represent concepts or whole words, and alphabet, right? At some point, somebody takes the hieroglyphic alphabet, or hieroglyphic script, which predates the alphabetic script, and repurposes it to represent sounds instead of ideas. Okay, this is the theory of how we move from hieroglyphic into alphabetic. What's interesting is that this discovery, if it truly is alphabetic, because it's a clay cylinder with some shapes carved into it that very closely resemble proto-Sinaitic yeah, language. The proto-Sinaitic alphabet is the predecessor to Syriac, and then eventually, not Syriac, there's another one, and then eventually Hebrew, okay? If this is true, it means that written language, or alphabetic written language, actually coexisted with hieroglyphic much earlier than we thought, and it existed in Syria, Iraq, which is fascinating. All that to say is that what we're discovering more and more is the ancient world is actually much more complex and civilized than we, even 50 or 100 years ago thought it was. I mean, you remember when we did a study on legalism? So we went through the Hebrew laws, but we also went through the Babylonian laws, etc. Is that many of the things that we think are being invented, by the Hebrew people, they're just stealing from somebody else. So again, another long answer to your short question is there probably were written records. Where they were on file, I don't know. But again, keep in mind that it might not necessarily been in writing like we're thinking of it. Because, you you spent your writing material, it might have been a clay tablet, right? It might have been a marker. So there's several times in the Old Testament witness where you'll hear so-and-so set up a marker, right? Something big happens and they set up a marker. that, there's theories that might be how land was claimed. You'd literally build a pile of stones and put a mark on it, indicating that this was your land. Other short answer, I don't really know, but I suspect yes. I want to imagine yes. It's much more civil, again, to use that word, it's a much more complex world than we thought before. We assumed that they were barely just past of the era of sticks and stones and being able to make fire, but it's much different. Well, that's way, way, way back, right? This language is complicated at this point in time. And that, by the way, is one of the things that is complex for this world as well, too, is dialect and language and how it changes significantly, especially when you have more isolated social groups, right? Like, you ever try to talk to somebody from like the deep, deep part of Louisiana? Or, go visit a random Finnish home in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Imagine that kind of language isolation, but in a much more closer, area. So that's another source of conflict. The Moabites probably had a different, if not different language, a different dialect from the Hebrew people. Anyways, sorry. Somebody else have something? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Here's the fascinating thing, is comparing, so both Job and Ruth fall under the name that I threw out last week, the 5 books that are used ritually over the course of the Hebrew worship year. What's interesting is to compare the narrative arc of Job and the narrative arc of Ruth, and you're right, both of them lose everything at the beginning. God gives Job everything back, theoretically, if you hold that those final verses are not in a later editorial edition. Ruth gets it back on her own. We'll talk about that. It's, okay, I'll shut up. Any other questions about Ruth? Or anything?
I see we're on chapter 3 and I haven't been here for 1 minute.
We're on chapter 3. Do you want me to recount the story?
I would just like to hear your version.
My version of it. Okay. So for those of you that haven't been here, there's a woman named Naomi who is married to a guy named Elimelech. They are from Ephraim, which is kind of smack dab in the middle, just north of modern-day Jerusalem. And they are living in Bethlehem when they decide to move to Moab, which is not in Utah. Right? It's not in Utah. It's somewhere east of ancient Israel. And again, we'll pull up our map here. Ancient Israel was bigger than modern day Israel, at least during the tribal period, right? Because here's the Dead Sea, here's the Sea of Galilee. Here is Jerusalem, and again, owned by the tribe of Benjamin. If you were here for our talk about Judges 19, genocide of the Benjaminites leads to Judah possessing Jerusalem, which is an interesting and complex history. Anyways, they're from Ephraim. At some point, they moved to Bethlehem, which is in Judah, and then they moved to Moab, which is somewhere over here. Okay, and in doing so, they essentially emigrate, right? They move out of the land that their people are from into a new land. They have 2 sons whose names I don't remember off the top of my head. Both those sons marry. One is married to Ruth. Another one is married to a woman named Orpah. And what happens, like in Job, Oprah, not Oprah, Orpah. What happens, like in Job, is everybody dies. Elimelech dies, the 2 sons die, and Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are left essentially impoverished, right? Because of the social idiosyncrasies of the ancient world, insofar as that women couldn't own property. So all of whatever Elimelech and the 2 sons had, whether it was land, animals, even personal property, would not transfer to the women. Yay. Again. So they're left with a decision. And the decision that is made is Naomi decides that she's going to go back to her people, back to Bethlehem is where she decides to go. And she tells Naomi or Orpah and Ruth, you go back to your people, your parents, aka, see if you can get remarried. That's the best bet for you, right? I'm done. Because she's past childbearing age. She's probably not going to remarry. I'm guessing, and this is all hypothetical, we don't know, I'm guessing she's just hoping that somebody will remember her and care for her, right? Until she can't glean fields anymore, basically. Orpah and Ruth both say, no, we're going to stick with you. Naomi gives them a stern talking to. Orpah finally says, okay, I'm going to go. Ruth says, no, I'm going to stay with you. And there's a great passage at the end of chapter 1, which we read, which is, my people, or your people will be my people, your God will be my God. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful passage. In chapter 2, they arrive in Bethlehem. Naomi is recognized by the women in Bethlehem, and Ruth goes about making contacts and doing work. So she's gleaning the field. So according to the Levitical Deuteronomical law, if you are a landowner and you have fields that produce edible foods, you're supposed to leave 10% of it unharvested so that the widow, the orphan, and the poor can come behind and glean again. And so that's what Ruth does. But it's not as simple as they leave this section unharvested. How it actually works is the harvesters come through and then the gleaners come in behind them taking whatever's left. Ruth is doing that, and she gets recognized by Boaz. Now Boaz doesn't know her, but Boaz would like to know her. It's kind of there's a lot of, so one of the things about Ruth is there's a lot of entendre, what are the words I'm looking for here? Innuendo, thank you. The bird flu innuendo. That's a Jeff Foxworthy joke from a long time ago. Anyways, so there's a lot of innuendo, and this is hard to pinpoint because we know what's happening, but we don't know enough about the Hebrew language to point out the specific words. There are a couple of specific words which we'll get to where we're pretty sure everybody knew what they're talking about. When we get to the uncovering of the feet, that's when it gets naughty. But there's some innuendo going on there. Insofar as that, Boaz sees Ruth, okay? And again, he doesn't just notice her, he notices her. That's kind of what the text is alluding to. And what's going on for Ruth and Naomi, because Naomi is back wherever they found shelter, Ruth is the one doing the gleaning, is do they want to let that continue? Because there is both opportunity and risk involved there. And the opportunity is that if Boaz decides that he wants to make a covenant with Ruth, in other words, take her as his wife or one of his wives, that's good. That's good for Ruth and probably for Naomi as well, too, since Ruth has attached herself to Naomi. If Boaz doesn't do the honorable thing, that could leave them in a worse place than before. So Ruth and Naomi kind of have this conversation, but Naomi says something important, which is she recognizes Boaz as well. We don't know if she knew Boaz when their family lived here, but there's some kind of connection that she's making of no, he's a good man. And I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but Naomi is saying to Ruth, no, this is a blessing. He's a good man. And that's where we find ourselves today. So, let me pop back to the end of chapter 2 so we can segue. Yes. Yes, right there. And again, we don't know the nature of that relationship, right? We don't know how well they knew each other. But here's the closing thing. So, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. And then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth or Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise you might be bothered in another field." Do we understand what she's saying there? Okay. So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So yeah, good memory, Matt. Boaz is also a relative of Naomi. But, again, the important thing is that Naomi is saying, no, this is a dude we can trust theoretically. Okay. Now comes the dance, so to speak. So Naomi, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you." Do we get what she's kind of intimating? Yeah. Okay. We need to set you up, is essentially what Naomi's saying. Because again, the world they live in, their security is through marriage. That's it. That's your singular option. Now, here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." Okay. What's going on here? What's going on here? And here's the thing. What's with the uncovering of the feet? Well, maybe, but they're not wearing these. They're probably wearing some form of sandal, right? Yeah. You could be. I know if my feet get uncovered in the night, I wake up because my feet are cold, right? Is she saying, well, wake them up gently? Maybe. It might, yeah. Is feet a euphemism for something else? Yeah. The answer here is D, all of the above. You understand what's going on here, right? She is washing, she's anointing herself, she's putting on perfume, right? Probably scented oils. She's prettying up. And she's going to him after he has eaten and drunk, right? So after he's passed out, right? And she's putting herself in a potentially compromising position. Do we see how this might be a gamble? Right? Do we see how this could potentially go poorly? Would you consider this to be, honorable, upright behavior? Yeah. But okay, and here's the important thing, right? In that world, is it? What's that? That's not how I met Elen either. It is a way to get things done. And this is the fun part about this text. So let me remind you of some of the facts, is that this story is told every year as part of the story of the Hebrew people, right? And some of that reason comes in at the end when we figure out whose son, who Ruth's offspring are. But there's also a celebration of something here. And this is a story that is repeated throughout the Hebrew Bible, which is the story of women getting things done in whatever manner they need to, and it being accounted as righteousness. Okay? So I mentioned last week my favorites, right? Judah and Tamar. Whose staff and whose robe is this, right? Oh, I guess I'm not going to have you executed for adultery after all, right? One of my favorites, which is Jael shoving the tent peg through the foreign general's head after she gave him milk to drink and had him lie down in her tent. He thought something very different was going to happen. These are, Rahab, right? Rahab, the quote-unquote prostitute living in Jericho when Joshua's spies show up looking for shelter, right? And she shelters them with the promise that she's going to be remembered after the city falls, right? These stories are all throughout the Hebrew witness. So there's this, and again, it's complex. Because on one hand, you have a world in which women are functionally property. And on the other hand, you have a narrative which celebrates these women using the rules against, bending and using the rules to do well for themselves and others, and that being celebrated as righteousness. Paul, you got a great thought in your mind.
Well, just we were talking about the land ownership.
Yeah.
The phrase "with whose young women you have been working," Boaz owns the women.
Yes.
The women come with the land.
Yes.
And a lot of us don't keep that connection in our brain. We think, oh, well, you can pick up and leave your agricultural roots behind. You can leave the farm if you want. There's no place to go
Yeah.
for the vast majority of humanity
Yep.
in the beginning of the later agricultural revolution, right?
Yeah.
And the tie to the land, I think, is something we do not fundamentally get in our unbelievable freedom today.
Yeah.
We go where we want to go. We do what we want to do in
Yep.
many, many ways in the United States in this century. But to be tied to the land is to be chattel. And it is chattel slavery. It still justifies that relationship today for millions of people on the planet.
Yep.
If you cannot defend your land, it is not your land. So it's very much a power struggle, and women are very much subservient in that struggle. And this is clearly a worthwhile gamble.
Yes. Absolutely.
Am I going to be child all of my life?
Yeah.
Even then I'll live, but that's not where we're headed.
Yeah.
So why is it that the Hebrew Bible spends this much time celebrating?
It's a really good question, Warner. And this is, this is really important. And I would say, I'm going to throw up some stuff out there, but I would say, we talked at the beginning about the questions that we should hold throughout Ruth. This is a question that you should hold throughout Ruth, but just hold in general. I'll try to be short here. So this is a book that's written by men, by and large, not just Ruth, the Hebrew scriptures in general. You're with me on this, okay? People tend to tell stories from the perspective of that they know, okay? One of my thinkings is that these stories are important to the Hebrew people because they tell the story of women, even though those stories aren't often at the forefront. And we can talk about a patriarchal society. We can talk about women being chattel and owned. And it's always more human than that, right? Like, women are still women. They're still people. And even though in this society they have almost no rights, they're still valued, and not just as property. And even though their social system doesn't express that, their stories are still valued. And there's something, and I can't, there have been papers written on this, again, my Hebrew scholar friends would be able to give you a better picture of it. But there's something about this type of story that these people find extremely valuable. I'm trying to think of an analog or a metaphor here. It's an underdog story. Does that make sense? I mean, that's part of it. That's not the whole thing. Everybody loves Rudy, and the movie Rudy with Notre Dame. Yeah, we love underdog stories. Women are definitely the underdogs in the ancient world in a lot of ways. I think that's part of it. I think there's more to it. I'm going to go ahead and say that there's a Holy Spirit aspect to this as well too, which is even when human beings insist on being total jerks, that the Holy Spirit manages to crack us open and let the light shine through, and we get to see the stories of women, even though we, even in the modern era, continue to not treat people well, women and minorities included, is that we manage to sneak those stories into our bigger story. I think God has something to do with that,
Do you think Boaz had many wives?
We'll find out. Yeah. 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 Yep. and this is, this is where I have, again, this is kind of a cop out. I mean, this is where I have to say that, the divine is present in the Bible. And when you look at the genealogy of Jesus, the women that are in there are remarkable, right? And it's not just Ruth. Andy, and then Maureen said something too.
Have a Jewish faith without the women being present, not just the fact that we're going to be people, but the faith itself. Not also Jews. I think the Jewish faith is structured such that you have to have women there. And because you don't have a Seder until you have a woman. And the woman has a very important role in the family. And if nothing else, you won't have it. It won't occur without them. Because they have a very key role.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, right. And this is, I would add, how would I put it? This is why, I'm repeating myself, this is why understanding context is so important, right? And ownership of women is not unique to the Hebrew people in the ancient world, okay? And like, Paul pointed out, it's not unique to the ancient world either. And yet, these stories continue to shine through, right? And there are many, many, many stories of women and others who have been oppressed, managing to game the system, work under the system, shine through, insist on being taken. This isn't about equal rights, this story, right? This is about, and this is kind of the powerful thing about this story too. This is Ruth taking care of her mother-in-law, right? That's what this is. That's what all of this is. And so that passage at the end of chapter 1, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, is one of the most profound creedal statements that we have in the Hebrew Bible. That should be our creed on Sunday morning. Chutzpah.
Yeah.
Ruth has chutzpah. Yeah. Yeah. This is definitely not, and again, I don't want to make a blanket statement about modern Jews versus the people that were around during Ruth, but there's some cultural idea that's being expressed there, that valuing of chutzpah, which we see elsewhere, right? So like in indigenous cultures in America, you've always got the trickster, that manages to win not through power or strength, but through wisdom and connivery and all that. The coyote or the crow, they have chutzpah, you could say. Anyways, yeah, it's something that's present in our it's an underdog story. Linda.
Well, and again, the word has a choice. One
Yeah.
is to become a prostitute,
Yeah.
and one is to go glean in the fields and work to support her mother. But the way she did it and the way she followed her Naomi's instructions, she did it to build respect from Boaz. She did it to where he realized she was not just flirting with all the workers, the male workers, to get a husband, that she actually was devoted to Naomi and that she was being careful in how she presented herself until it came time to present herself to I am your servant.
Yes, and I would make one important distinction there as well too. Where she's being righteous is in what her goal is, which is taking care of Naomi. That is the righteousness. Her behavior is very not righteous. Because, and this is important, because there are many nowadays who would point at this behavior and not make a distinction between that and prostitution. Okay? And in fact, this is one of those unseen wars that is fought about the Bible every day, right? Is Rahab an independent merchant who happens to be a woman, or is she a prostitute? Is Mary Magdalene a single woman in a society that doesn't like single women, who's a close confidant of Jesus, or is she a prostitute? And the thing is that there, and we're seeing it more than ever, is it's easier to call women like this prostitutes than it is to grapple with the very uncomfortable societal situation that forces them into this behavior.
Well, that's my point, is that she somewhat
Absolute.
distinguishes herself as,
Absolutely.
she distinguishes herself as a good woman.
But she does that through her relationship with Naomi. This behavior is, yes, at best. And this is exactly what's going on here. This is exactly what's going on here. Let me read this, and then we'll talk. Now we get to the story.
Jesse, do you imagine that Ruth being a Moab might have been a different
Yes.
color skin
Yes.
and very standing out,
Yes.
where he definitely noticed her?
Absolutely. And it's hard to tell which physical characteristics might have differed, but notice in the text she is almost always referred to as Ruth the Moabite, right? So the author is trying to remind us of that point. And again, I don't know if there's a significant difference in skin tone or hair color, or if it's just you recognize the way that somebody walks and talks and styles their hair differently, right?
But she stood out.
Why were Swedes and Norwegians able to, tell each other apart for hundreds and hundreds of years, even though from a modern perspective they're all just blonde-haired, blue-eyed? I mean, again, I'm making some very, but do you get my point, right? We find ways to tribalize, okay. Quick joke, and I'm not going to tell it well. There's two guys on a bridge, right? Have you heard this one before? Two guys on a bridge, and they bump into each other. I don't know. They're watching the seagulls or something, and they're getting to know each other. They're making small talk, and the one says, "Oh, I'm a Methodist," and the guy goes, "Oh, Methodist, which convention? The Western Mountain Convention." "Oh, Western Mountain Convention. Is that the the Blue Western or the Red Western Mountain?" "The Blue Western." "Oh, me too. Blue Western. Which conference do you hold to? The 1817 or the 1819 conference?" "1817." "Oh, me too. 1817, session B or session A?" "Session A." "Heretic," and he shoves him off the bridge. Right? Is that we find a way to identify differences, no matter how little those differences are. That's tribalism, right? But you have a very important instinct there, which is absolutely Boaz recognizes her as being Moabite, because everybody recognizes her as being Moabite. And on one hand, that could be a boundary, that could be a barrier. On the other hand, it could make her exotic. We use that kind of icky language sometimes. Good insight. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, a lot said with a little word, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came quietly and uncovered his feet and lay down. Oh man, that sentence. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." Do you realize, she just said, "Can I share your blankets?" Are we, okay, thank you. I don't have to get into too much detail. What about this statement, next of kin? This is a very, 100%. This is a very innocuous term. But remember when we talked about how inheritance works, right? Judah and Tamar. Tamar was supposed to be married to Judah's next son, and so on and so forth, and they were supposed to get her with child. Everything is about kinship. The fact that Boaz is kin to Naomi is a lever that Naomi and Ruth can use for obligation.
As in, leave right now.
Yes, exactly. For you are next of kin. He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord." My daughter, we'll come to that in a second. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first, and you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do so. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another. They slipped out before people were up and about. For he said, it must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Then he said, bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, how did things go with you, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Okay, does everybody understand functionally what happened here? She called out next of kin rights, which is complicated because she's not technically next of kin, right? She has no blood relation to Boaz. She is tying it through Naomi, okay? That is her next of kin claim, which is tenuous at best, okay? Because Naomi, even though she is kin to Boaz, the thing that tied Naomi to Ruth is dead, right? I don't want to belabor this, but I just want to emphasize that Boaz is going the extra mile here, okay? This is now Boaz being righteous, okay? I don't need to go into detail on the position that Ruth was putting herself in, because I very much think that Ruth understood that if this means that I end up sleeping with this man, that's what this means. And again, I don't want to get into reading behind the lines or between the lines or anything like that, but at least according to the text, that's probably not what happens, right? Boaz recognizes that Ruth is making an advance of sorts, but her calling out next of kin is a very similar line to when Tamar says to Judah, is this your robe? Right? Which is, you have an obligation and you're not fulfilling it, okay? What Ruth is doing is she's saying to Boaz, hey, we're in an interesting position here, potentially compromising for both of us. Are you going to do the right thing? And he says yes, okay? And he's going to do the right thing so far as he's not the closest relative to Naomi. So he says, actually, there's somebody, according to our legal system, who should, by all rights, be doing this. So I'm going to go find out if he's interested, okay? And if not, I'm going to take care of it. So again, not only is he doing the right thing, he's following the letter of the law in the process. It's kind of important here. It's kind of important. This is not a random detail that's thrown in here. We are getting a better picture of who Boaz is. Thoughts? We can jump ahead to chapter 4. There's not a lot left in Ruth. Yes. 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 And you've got your finger on something which is really important, which is we will never fully understand or appreciate the cultural sensitivity here. Like we're at best being able to paint this in very broad strokes, right? We kind of get the macro things that are happening here, but there's a lot of subtext in here in the story, but just in the culture in general that we'll never appreciate, right? We'll never be able to fully understand. I mean, when you got married, if you guys got married and you went to your partner's family's house and you sat down for that first meal together, and you realize that you weren't in Kansas anymore, right? And you're trying to piece together all of these little cultural things that have built up in that family over time immemorial, and you are an outsider, right? And maybe at some point in your lives together, you felt like you slipped inside that circle, right? But you never really fully do, right? This is where we're at with these stories, except we're thousands of years separated and in a different world. But we get some of it, right? But yeah, you've got your finger on a really important thing here. Two worlds, yep, equally important. Yeah. Yep. Well, and like Paul said too, right? We can't fully appreciate being tied to the land. I know these stories, right? Like I've talked about, my ancestors' emigrated from Norway because they couldn't own land, right? So you take that risk to move to the new world out of, the hope that you can control your own destiny, right? You can control your own land. But like this continues to be an issue. I mean, we don't use the word land anymore. We use the word housing, right? Is housing a right, right? Or is housing a commodity, right? That we can trade and buy and collect and consume, and it's a complicated conversation, but it's one that's very important right now. Like we were walking through Selwood yesterday, and there are a lot of new like townhomes. So we talk about housing density and infill, right? And it's funny, Hélène, coming from France, where they are a land of villages, but very densely situated villages. Like this is the thing that one of the things I realized was very different. You talk about the thing you can't quite put your finger on. My first time in France, we flew into Paris, and then we took the train to northeast France, and then we drove, or the other way around. We took the train to southeast France, and we drove to northeast France. And you drive, and you might have like woods for a little bit, but it's like one village to one village to one village to one village to a city to a village to a village. Here, when my wife's sister came to visit, she was shocked when we drove to Silver Falls that we drove for an hour and saw no houses, right? That there's that much wilderness between Portland, a metropolitan area, and this place that we were going to, right? Absolutely mind-blowing to her. Where was I going with this? What was I talking about? Oh, Selwood. So Hélène looks at those townhouses and she's like, but there's no room there, right? They don't have a yard. They don't have anything. I'm like, yes, but that's housing. and that's one of the things that's hard to wrap. And we're watching Portland change in this way, right? But the reality is that we don't have enough housing for the number of people that need to live here. This is the new land, right? And it's still land. And on the other hand, we know that there are investors, both domestic and foreign, that are buying homes, tearing them down, basically owning land because it's wealth, right? And so there's kind of a really important question to think about there, which is, are we societally gonna allow housing to be a way that we make money, or are we gonna make sure that the citizens of the United States of America have a place to call home, to be sheltered? Anyways, I'm moralizing here, but yeah, Paul, you were gonna say something, and then leave. Okay.
On the Colorado Moab.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there's a counterbalance here.
Yes.
Not having these foreign relations.
Yes.
And just being another kind of exception to the structure.
Absolutely. And I was talking about the questions that we should hold through Ruth. This is one of those important questions. Because so Ruth is somewhere between 550 and 350 in that time range. And this is the conversation that's being had in a post-exile world, right? Is we were very intent on, like, here we are God's people, these are our boundaries, both physical and cultural, and we need to maintain the purity of these boundaries at all costs. And you get stories like Ruth, you get the conversations that are going on in Ezra and Nehemiah, you get the conversation that's going on in Jonah, right? Do I not care about this city of 120,000 persons plus donkeys and whatever, right? That they're not Jews, but they're God's people. Ruth is the best Jew in this story, right? She's the best Jew in this story, and she's a Moabite. And that is such a shift in thinking that it's hard for us to appreciate just how kind of like world-shaking that is, right? And again, our geographic boundaries are so soft now, right? Like, we have tons of friends that, midway through COVID moved back to the East Coast to be closer to family, and they could do that because my friend Alex, even though he still works for a company in Portland, can work remotely from Cape Cod. Like, that is such a different world than this world. But because our geographic boundaries are so different, our social boundaries are so different as well too. Like, a kid from Michigan can marry a French woman, and the things that upset aren't really significant, in a way that it might have been, like, for example, in World War II, when you've got GIs marrying women and figuring out, what that means culturally and et cetera. And not to mention going back before that, when it wasn't about nations, it was about whether it was okay to marry the girl in the village, the next village over, right? And was this going to cause friction, or was it going to unite the two peoples together? Yeah. It's crazy.
I was just thinking about the use of the story.
Yes.
And how we make a very big deal on the fact that this is one of many stories about the unbelief, the four that we have.
Yeah.
And how God especially takes the unbelief
Yeah.
or the broken,
Yep.
those who just don't have it all together, the losers, and makes something of that which is unexpected.
There.
I think, we live in a culture that goes, you're either a winner or a loser.
Yeah.
In our culture. And this is such a challenge right now.
Yeah.
But it's not unfamiliar in that it is her behavior that trumps her lineage,
Yeah.
her status. And so it is about character.
Yeah.
But it's also about what God does in the low, the Magnificat is right here. Ruth could sing the Magnificat.
Yeah.
And so we get that theme over and over and over.
Yeah.
And don't see it.
Yeah. There's a song by a man named Guster, who actually, this song is now in All Creation Sings, which is the latest hymnal, songbook that Augsburg put up. But it's called Beautiful Things, and the chorus is, "You make beautiful things out of dust, and you make beautiful things out of us." Which is, what Paul was articulating, is that God tends to work specifically with the most unexpected people. And that this includes Jesus, by the way. Can anything good come out of Nazareth, But what's interesting is that you could almost look at Ruth as an advocate. Right? That's, she's accompanying Naomi. But in terms of, we think about, in a modern context, you hear a lot of people talking about advocacy, advocating for, on behalf of. We've had a lot of social movements in the past few years, Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And one of the things that always comes up is, but how is that being achieved? And a lot of times, it's in ways that makes us uncomfortable, right? Like, go back to the civil rights movement, and how many times did was it, well, I just wish that, I wish that they would do it, in a way that didn't upset us, Ruth does it in a way that upsets us, right? It makes our stomachs do that little wobbly thing of like, I'm not sure I would share this story with my niece, I'm not sure I would read this one to my kids. There's too much weird stuff going on here. But this is the way in which the poor, the oppressed, the ostracized, the losers, right, that God tends to work with. This is the way they have to do it, right? And for me, that makes me think about, like, when I find myself going, but I wish they wouldn't use that language, or I wish they would do this in a way that didn't affect that. It's kind of like, well, but what options are left, right? What options are left to them? There's a very interesting conversation there.
I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm sitting here looking at that, and we talked a lot about the fact that women didn't own anything.
Yeah.
She's selling the land.
Yes.
And I'm going, okay, if she doesn't own anything, how could she keep selling?
Because, again,
Or she's just
Naomi can't own anything. If Naomi got married and had a son, her son would inherit those land rights. So Naomi isn't selling her land, she's selling Elimelech's land. And she's doing it through the marriage of Ruth and Boaz. So again, this is not standard. I want to emphasize this. What is happening from a legal perspective is that Boaz is backing Naomi's move, which is attaching the Elimelech's land rights to her daughter-in-law. Does that make sense? So rather than marrying Naomi and selling the land rights, they're marrying Ruth and gaining that land. Okay? So Matt, you brought up the question earlier of how and did they keep track of this stuff? Well, here you go. Here's evidence that somebody is keeping track of this stuff, that Elimelech has land. Now here's another question. Boaz is next of kin, or close enough. Is there a chance that Boaz claimed Elimelech's land and has been holding on to it this entire time? And now Boaz is essentially selling Elimelech's land back to himself in order to redeem Naomi and Ruth? Yes, there's a good chance of that, okay? Because they're not just going to let that land lie fallow. And we know that Elimelech and Naomi have been gone long enough to have sons that have grown to adulthood, to get married, to die, and to move back. So we're talking decades here, right? So that land hasn't just sat there waiting for Elimelech to return. Chances are Boaz has been farming it, right? But now, again, it's hard, but like, to be fair, land rights issues are hard no matter what era you're in. But yeah, Naomi doesn't own it. Naomi's offspring owns it. Okay? Which is weird to think about, but that's how the ancient world worked. And they're allowing Ruth's offspring to claim it. Does that make sense? Paula? Because it didn't exist. But this is, and again, you have to read under it. It didn't exist because Boaz probably controlled it. So, I mean, again, Boaz is doing the double righteous thing here. Because Boaz is effectively saying, first of all, we're going to make sure we do this right. And number two, the land that was my kinsman's, Elimelech's, and none of this is spoken out loud here. It's all behind the scenes. The land that was my kinsman's, Elimelech's, which I've been farming for the past 20 years and is functionally mine, I'm going to attach to Naomi and then to Ruth so that I can redeem them and things can be okay for them, right? Yeah, exactly. It's not totally altruistic. Now the land is definitely his. He's not just holding it in trust for when Elimelech comes back. Now it's definitely, he's a smart dude. Like let's be fair about that. Well, we got a couple. Let's read ahead here. Okay, you've all been reading this, but here these next lines are important. So he goes to the next of kin and says, "Do you want to redeem the land, Naomi's land?" And the guy says, "Of course." And then he says, "But beware, it's attached to the hand of Ruth." And notice how he says Ruth's name, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name and its inheritance. And the next of kin said, "I cannot redeem it myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." So do you see what Boaz does here? This is beautiful. So he's like, hey, he goes to the next of kin. He's like, "Hey, do you want this property?" The guy's like, "Yeah, absolutely. Just to let you know," right? It's got strings attached, and one of them is a foreign woman, and he emphasizes that a foreign woman whose husband died, so a widow, not a dog, and that's important, right? And you're redeeming this dead man's inheritance. So again, by the way, redemption of inheritance, again, is that the son ends up owning the property. Does that make? Yes. Okay. We're already, okay, I'm going to skip ahead. We can come back to this in 2 weeks because this is important. But, just for you to something to chew on here. Okay. So Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive. She bore a son. Blessed, 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 blessed. Son has been named to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay? Okay. So we've linked a very important story here. Okay? And now these are the descendants of Perez. But wait a second. Who the heck is Perez? Well, Perez is maybe Obed. It's also maybe their second son. Okay? These are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Okay. Hold on. Okay. Here's the genealogy of Jesus. Abraham was the father of Isaac, the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Wait a second. I thought his name, Okay. And Perez the father of Hezron the father, okay, when we talked about Tamar, right? Okay. Hezron the father of Aram the father of Aminadab, Nahshon, Solomon, Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father now hold on, I thought his name was Perez. But what is the linking verb here? Perez is the son of Tamar, who, similar to Ruth, bent the rules to make the right thing happen. Okay, so this is a never-ending question that exists in the book of Ruth: is there a point being made here, right? Because these are two distinct spots in the genealogy, separated by generations and generations. Why is there this intentional confusing of names? His name's Obed. Why all of a sudden are we talking about Perez? Or is it a callback to the story of Judah and Tamar, that here is yet another example of a compromised woman doing the righteous thing, and they're in the genealogy? Something to chew on, something to think about. Anyways, yeah. All right, we can go to church.